Freedom of movement, which is challenged for Rohingya. They should have documents to be able to free as any other citizen living in Rakhine State. Now the refugee can only buy rice and cooking oil and a little bit of chili, but no longer anything else, no vegetables, no fruits, no nothing. The Rohingya population should become less dependent of that aid. No, nothing more than they want to become more independent. They want to at least be partially able to access the basic subsistence themselves by having a bit of money to do that. Here on a Saturday morning in a full house to exchange around the Rohingya in Bangladesh is very encouraging, because this is one of the most vulnerable, discriminated refugee populations in the world, generously hosted by Bangladesh now for so many years. The occasion today is rather somber. We mark the 6th anniversary of the most recent huge influx of Rohingya in Bangladesh in that week of August 2017, when over 700,000 Rohingya had to flee in a week's time coming here. It was the single largest refugee movement globally at that time, only outpaced recently by the Ukrainians into Europe. The Rohingya fled atrocities, violence in Myanmar's Rakhine State. Bangladesh welcomed them generously under the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister. This was an example of humanity and generosity, which unfortunately these days is hardly copied elsewhere. I wish it were. Again, Dr. Mofibo Haq made the comparison, who in the continent I come from, Europe. This is not the case at the moment. And Bangladesh has been doing this. It was also memorized this morning by various speakers, without having a legal or normative framework to protect and assist refugees. Bangladesh is not party to the 1951 Convention, nor is any other country in the region doing this. Nevertheless, by using its national framework of laws, we somehow manage to not only protect the refugees here, but also to somehow allow them to be assisted and somehow have access to main issues of education and of health, etc. We all know that the solution for this refugee crisis is the return to Myanmar. We know that the Rohingyas themselves don't want anything else than that. But to return, the conditions for the return needs to be created. And we also know, there's no need to repeat it here, what the situation in Rakhine State is. Since their latest exodus, it has not improved at all. This is not just a problem for Bangladesh. This is a problem for the international community. The international community must renew every effort to make a return possible. The United Nations, which I represent here, we will continue to support any of these efforts to create the conditions to be conducive to such voluntary and sustainable return to Rakhine State. One element here is that for the UNHCR and the partners in Rakhine State, we continue working there. We've always been working there. We've always been continue working there, although it's very difficult. We have not that easy access, but we are there. One condition for sustainable return into Rakhine State is that we are present continuously with the partners so that we can monitor any future return, that it is safe and dignified, but also that the subsequent reintegration is sustainable, that it will not lead again to an outflow as we have seen in the 90s when Rohingya went back from Bangladesh to Myanmar, but because the conditions in Myanmar were far from conducive, they again then came back to Bangladesh. Every refugee has a right to return and should be allowed to exercise that right, even in situations where large-scale return to the country of origin is maybe not possible. But there might be, within these situations, nevertheless, areas where for individuals return might be possible. But in order to allow a Rohingya in this case to exercise that right, he or she must take that decision freely, but also based on all the information about the situation back home available, credible, comprehensive, accurate information. The UNHCR in Bangladesh, should that moment come, will be there to counsel Rohingya, to assess the voluntariness of the process and the decision taken, but also that the full, accurate, credible information is available to the persons concerned. The return, as per the bilateral agreement between Bangladesh and Myanmar of 2017, should be, of course, to the locations of origin. But if these no longer exist because they have been burned and destroyed, to other locations close to where they used to live, which of their own choice, as per the agreement between the two countries. And also, as that has been stipulated in many of the documents, and it was also already memorized here, any returnee back home should have access to services, education, health services, to access to livelihood, reclaiming any land or property or housing they used to have, but also freedom of movement, which is challenged for Rohingya. They should have documents to be able to free as any other citizen living in Rakhine State. And a pathway to citizenship. A pathway at least. A ticket too. Because as we all know, that's the fundamental problem. But we can work towards that. But as we continue to work into that situation, for the moment we have close to 1 million Rohingya languishing in the camp here. They continue to be entirely dependent on humanitarian assistance for most basic and urgent needs. Food and proper nutrition, secure and dignified shelter, access to safe water and sanitation, basic health care, social protection for the most vulnerable women and children and elderly and disabled people, and so on and so on. But this humanitarian assistance is also needed to provide any family in the camps with some gas to cook their food. Also a very important item and a quite expensive ticket. They are dependent on our support for blankets in the winter, for cut kitchen utensils, for mosquito nets. And then, of course, every time there is a monsoon rain, there's a landslide, there's a storm, if not a cyclone, Mocha as we saw. We need to rebuild again the shelters, which are very fragile, of bamboo and tarpaulin, to underline the temporariness of their presence. But we need to do something about this, because this is too costly to reconstruct any time the shelter every 6 months. We need to build back better. And then, of course, very importantly, we provide education in the camps. We provide skills development programs and livelihood programs. I will come back to that. But everybody in the camps nowadays, with basic needs, face now a very difficult situation, because with the decline in humanitarian funding from the international community, we can no longer meet all these needs. As of today, in August, in 2023, we have a kind of joint response plan as the humanitarian community signed up with the government of Bangladesh, and only funded for a third. Whereas in the year now we are 8 out of 12 months, it should be funded for 3/4. It's only funded for a third. So we've seen already this year that our colleagues from the World Food Programme, which are responsible for the food distribution and the running of food markets in the camps, they had to reduce the monthly electronic wallet. Every adult refugee has $12 to $8, which means that now the refugee can only buy rice and cooking oil and a little bit of chili, but no longer anything else, no vegetables, no fruits, no nothing. And in fact, mothers can no longer put every 3 times a day a meal on the table, maybe 2. Or she has to choose between her children. The older child has to skip a meal because the younger child is still growing up, needs to have her 3 meals. And there are cascading consequences. If you cut in food rations, the nutrition status of children is going down. The acute malnutrition is going up, and it impacts on the development of the child. Girls are already married off too early. Now more will be done because one mouse less on the table. Children will be taken out of school to start working in the informal economy in the camp. So there are many, many consequences of these cuts in food. And we also see that people continue to take the boats out of despair to Malaysia, to Indonesia, with all the consequences of that. We saw 3,000 people at least recorded last year, of which 10% perished at sea. We need to really do better before things become even worse. Now, not everything is as bleak, as was also said. We have seen, particularly the last years, improvements in the camp. We've seen now that more than 300,000 Rohingya students are in school, in the learning center, and they follow for once now a proper curriculum. It's the Myanmar curriculum, it's in the Myanmar language, because it all prepares them for a future return to Myanmar. But they follow our structure and they love it. And they are all enthusiastic, and in all grades. This is also not self-evident, because particularly in the higher grades, they didn't come with that much indication, and now they can benefit from it. We have also been rolled out a huge program in what we call skills development, in training the adolescent, if not the adults, amongst the refugees, women, men, in all kinds of trades they used to do in the Rakhine state, in agriculture, in technical professions, in healthcare, repairing, maintaining solar energy, etc. So this is a huge new program which gives purpose to the lives of the refugees. They can do something with their quiet skills. They're not sitting idle. We also know that in the camps situated in Cox's Bazar, they live in an area which is prone to many natural disasters. I mentioned it already. Storms, monsoon rains, landslides. We had Cyclone Mocha, I mentioned it, causing a lot of devastation. We have fires in the camp. Every time we have to build back. Every time it is a challenge. We need more weather-resistant, hazard-resistant material to build back. And we are in discussion with the authorities to do that. It's still portable, the shelter. You can still dismount it immediately to take with you to Myanmar, the time coming. But it needs to be more robust material, because we simply don't have the money anymore to every few months rebuild the shelter, fragile as it is. The international community has so far provided loads of money to this response. Over $3.8 billion since 2017. But as I said, we now see a steep funding shortfall, and this will not easily be compensated by the traditional donors if we don't widen our donor base. So we're reaching out to, for instance, the OIC. They're not only instrumental and key in the issues of justice and accountability, and the case of the Gambia supported by the OIC before the court in The Hague, the ICJ. They're also an important group of brotherly states who have expressed times and times again their solidarity with the Muslim Rohingya brothers and sisters, but we want them to follow up also with assistance, with support, with funding. So this month the UNHCR organized a senior level mission of the OIC to the camps to assess the situation, where they could also possibly in the future support the financial effort for the humanitarian response, and notably the Gulf countries amongst the OIC countries. But the other measures which should be taken to somehow offset for the reduced international foreign aid is that the Rohingya population should become less dependent of that aid. No, nothing more than they want to become more independent. They want to at least be partially able to access the basic subsistence themselves by having a bit of money to do that. It can be an electronic version, a wallet. And that can be done if we allow the Rohingya refugees, men and women, to be able to be more self-reliant by having a project for which they have been skilled in agriculture, but also as a teacher, as a health worker, working in social protection. And we do this already a lot. We have over 30,000 Rohingya who work as a volunteer and get a monthly stipend. But this needs to be developed much more, because simply the refugees, for the time they're in the camps, need to have more agency, more ability to somehow fend for their own needs. They want this. They don't want to stay dependent on aid. And this is something, however, we need to further discuss with the host government, because none of us want this to lead to integration. That's not on the agenda, and it will never be. But as an interim solution, while people need to stay capacitated for return and not sitting idle, we need to give them opportunity and agency to somehow do some gainful work in the camps, in the informal economy in the camps, and this is the way forward to also offset the negative consequences of the declining external international aid. We cannot leave the Rohingya crisis to Bangladesh alone. The international community has this responsibility to work towards the solution of the crisis. This is, of course, the return to Myanmar. That solution, however, is entirely political. There are no humanitarian solutions for humanitarian problems. The situation in Myanmar requires political dialogue, diplomatic engagement, concerted diplomatic engagement, and working on the ground in Rakhine State to create the reconstruction and development, but also a climate of rights for the refugees to be able to return safely and in a dignified manner. But as this solution might maybe not be very soon to be realized, we can work on other issues. And I just want to, at the end, refer to some remarks made by Dr. Asif Munir, who very helpfully referred to the so-called Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted in 2018. And long story short, this December 2023, there's a meeting at the level of heads of government and state, the so-called Global Refugee Forum, which is going to review the implementation of that Global Compact, and where we hope that with the states of the region, we can also have a discussion on the situation for the Rohingya, how collectively we can work on solutions through return, but also while return is still waiting in any larger numbers, we can help a country like Bangladesh, which hosts these million Rohingyas, to sustain that support and to work towards some interim solutions to enhance the resilience and the self-reliance of the Rohingya, of which I spoke. But also, as was also mentioned by one of the speakers, resettlement to third countries. This will not be in any large numbers. It will not make a difference really in the numbers. It will not even offset the increased 30,000 every year by birth in the camps, but at least it's a token of solidarity of the international community. Some of the most vulnerable refugees, or those there are who have no link whatsoever with Rakhine State anymore because they were born in the camps, that they can find a safe refuge elsewhere in the world. So we can look at a more comprehensive set of solutions, which is part of this Global Compact of Refugees. And also, finally, I want to say here and repeat what again Dr. Asif Munir said: we should not label and stigmatize the refugees. We need an objective narrative for them. We cannot set aside a whole population as if they are the source of all ills. They are not. They are persecuted, most discriminated, stateless people. Their own country doesn't recognize them. They are generally hosted by Bangladesh. It is difficult after all these years, but it's not a reason now to say that they are all the source of all the ills, demographic change, environmental degradation, drug trafficking. Yes, there are links, but they are not the source, and they're not the actors. And we need a positive, empathetic narrative, recognizing why this Rohingya needs protection and needs assistance. And they also need to have some agency to live their lives while they're here. It's very important that in the public domain we have a correct narrative about Rohingya. And finally, they must have their own voice. They, in the end, are the best ones to decide when it's time to go home, but they need to give a voice, they need to give purpose in their life, they need to give hopes in their lives, because that is the best way to keep the situation stable, protected, and from any otherwise instability and insecurity. Thank you very much.